In the autumn of 1898, in the county of Somerset in the west of England, a young widow named Marian Ashcroft stood on the gravel sweep of Levenshulme Court and listened to her mother-in-law explain, in the pleasant voice the woman kept for servants and tradesmen, why she had 1 hour to pack. The morning was fine. The beeches along the drive were turning gold, and somewhere behind the stables a gardener was burning leaves, and the smoke came drifting across the lawns as though the whole estate meant to make the day as beautiful as possible while it put her out. Marian was 31 years old. She had been born Marian Fairley, the only daughter of the rector of Combe St. Mary, a small parish of apple orchards and wet meadows a day's ride to the south. Her father had taught her Latin because there was no one else to teach, and thrift because there was no way to avoid it, and she had grown up poor in the way that clergy families were poor, which is to say respectably, with books on the shelves and darns in the linen. When Edmund Ashcroft of Levenshulme Court married her quietly in the spring of 1895, against the plainly stated wishes of his mother, the county had been astonished, and his family had never once allowed her to forget it. His mother, Augusta, had a way of introducing her that managed to apologize for her in the same breath. His elder brother, Julian, simply looked through her, the way a man looks through glass. For 3 years it had not mattered, because Edmund was kind, and Edmund was hers. Then, in the wet last weeks of that summer, the typhoid fever came through the district, and Edmund, who had gone twice into the village to sit with a dying tenant because he believed a landlord owed his people more than rent days, took the fever home with him. He was 3 weeks dying. Marian did not leave his room. On the last morning he held her hand and tried to say something, and could not finish it, and what he had meant to say went with him. He left no will. That was the family's phrase, repeated to the servants, to the parish, to the solicitors, until it wore a smooth path through every conversation in the house. No will was ever found, and Edmund's portion had never been settled on him outright. And so everything he had lived on folded itself quietly back into the estate, into Julian's keeping and Augusta's management, and the law had nothing at all to say about the woman he had loved. What provision his widow received would be a matter of the family's generosity. Marian learned exactly what that generosity weighed on the morning the leaves were burning. "You came to this family with nothing," Augusta told her on the gravel, unhurried, almost gentle, "and it would be dishonest, I think, to let you leave it with more." There was a moment when Marian might have begged, and she watched Augusta wait for it with a patience that was very nearly appetite, and she found she would rather sleep in a hedge. She packed 1 carpet bag. A footman she had always been kind to carried it as far as the lodge gates and could not look at her. The carrier's van took her up at the crossroads between a crate of hens and a churn, and that was how the widow of Edmund Ashcroft left Levenshulme Court with 1 bag, her mother's garnet brooch, and $11.40 saved out of her housekeeping, which was every cent she had in the world. She had nowhere to go. Her father was 2 years dead, the rectory at Combe St. Mary long since filled by a stranger, and Pride is a poor lodging, but it was most of what she had, so she took a room over a saddler's shop in the market town of Marley, paid a week in advance, and sat down on the narrow bed to think. She was penniless, or the next thing to it. She could sew, she could keep accounts, she could run a great house from the still room to the slate roof, and none of it would matter to anyone, because the only character she could offer came from a family that had just turned her out. Winter was 6 weeks away, perhaps less. She did not cry. She was saving that, the way she was saving everything else. It was in the 2nd week, in the public room below, that she first heard the Abbey laughed about. A copy of the county paper lay on the settle, and a carter was reading the sale notices aloud for the pleasure of the room, and one of them was this: to be sold by public auction at the Crown Hotel in Marley, Harrowfield Abbey, in the parish of Nether Harrow, with all its lands, appurtenances, and contents, as it stands, without reserve, by instruction of the trustees of the late owner, the property to pass to the highest bidder at whatever price may be freely offered. The room thought this the best joke of the month. Everyone knew Harrowfield Abbey, or knew of it. It had stood empty for 60 years. Its park was a wilderness, its windows were dark. Its chimneys had gone cold before most of the men in that room were born. Boys dared each other over its walls, and the bold ones came back saying the ivy had eaten the south front and the jackdaws owned the rest. Some said it was cursed. The carter said, to general delight, that he would bid his old boots and consider himself cheated. And a quieter voice near the fire said the strange part, the part the lawyers had never explained in 60 years, which was that the last of the Harrows had shut the place up herself, paid masons out of her own purse to brick up the finest room in it, her own chapel, and then one October night had simply gone. Vanished. No coach ordered. No box sent on. Gone. And the lawyers in Wells had held the whole estate ever since, under instructions nobody had ever read aloud. Marian sat very still by the window with her mending and listened, and something in the notice caught in her mind the way a thorn catches wool. At whatever price may be freely offered, lawyers did not write such words for amusement. Somebody, 60 years ago, had wanted that written, had paid to have it written, and had been thinking of somebody when they paid. She lay awake that night doing arithmetic she already knew by heart. A week's lodging was 50 cents. Bread was bread. Between her and the workhouse stood $11.40, less what was already spent. And no roof in England had any reason to shelter her, and 3 miles outside the village of Nether Harrow stood 40 rooms and a slate roof that the whole county agreed were worth nothing at all. The auction was held on a Tuesday in the assembly room of the Crown, and half the district came, not one soul of them to bid. They came the way people go to a fair for the show of it. The auctioneer, a stout and sporting man, played to the room because there was nothing else to play to. At the table beside him sat a small, precise, elderly gentleman in a black frock coat with white side whiskers and wire spectacles, who was pointed out as Mr. Pettifer, of Pettifer and Snow, solicitors, of Wells, and who read the conditions of sale in a dry voice that somehow quieted the benches. Sold as it stands, all contents included, nothing accepted, nothing reserved. No warranty as to condition, possession immediate upon signature. And then the sentence the room had come to hear, read without a flicker. The property shall pass to the highest bidder at whatever price may be freely offered, such being the instruction of the late owner, which the trustees are bound to honor without variation. The auctioneer asked for an opening bid. He asked twice. A wit at the back offered a plug of tobacco, and the room rocked. Somebody else offered the tobacco and a pocket knife, and the auctioneer wiped his eyes and said, "Gentlemen, gentlemen," and the laughter rolled on in waves, warm, well-fed, and pitiless, and under it, Marian Ashcroft stood up. She had put on her gray dress, the good one, and she stood straight. Because a rector's daughter learns early how to be looked at by a full room, and into the first lull she said, clearly, $7. The silence lasted the length of a breath, and then the laughter came down like a slate off a roof. $7 for 40 rooms and a ruin and a park gone to briars. A farmer near her turned purple wheezing. The auctioneer, to his credit, did not laugh. He looked at Mr. Pettifer, and Mr. Pettifer looked at Marian for what felt to her a very long time. And then the old solicitor nodded once, and the gavel came down, and the noise of the room fell on her like weather she could not feel. Sold to the lady in gray. Somebody said mad. She heard it twice more before she reached the table. She was mad. The widow was mad, and perhaps she was, she thought, signing her name in a hand that did not shake. Mad the way the drowning are mad when they swim toward the one thing floating. The particulars took an hour. She counted out $7 in coins onto a green baize table, which left her $4.40 in the world, and in exchange she received the deed, engrossed on parchment older than her grandmother, and a ring of iron keys so heavy she had to carry it in both hands. And among them one small key of blackened steel, finer than the rest, that fitted nothing anyone had ever found. Mr. Pettifer gathered his papers with great deliberation, and when the room had mostly emptied, he stopped before her and looked at her over the wire spectacles. "Madam," he said, "I will tell you the only thing I am at liberty to tell you. My father served the late Miss Harrow, and I have served her trust my whole life without once understanding it. The instruction was any price freely offered. In 60 years, yours is the first." He settled his hat. "Whatever you find there," he said, "I believe it has been waiting for you," and he wished her good day and was gone, and Marian stood in the emptying room holding the keys to an abbey. And it is a fact that she laughed once alone at the size of what she had just done with $7. The carrier took her out the next morning as far as the lane end, and would take no fare, whether from kindness or because he wanted the story, and from there she walked. The lane ran sunken between high hedges, mist lying in the low fields either side. And for half a mile she saw nothing but hedge and sky, and then the trees opened, and Harrowfield Abbey stood up out of its wilderness in front of her, and she stopped walking, and for a while she forgot to breathe. It was vast, and it was drowned. It had been a priory once, real monks, real bells, before old King Henry's men had turned them out. And a family called Harrow had folded the ruin into a great house, so that Gothic arches ran into Tudor chimneys, and a cloister walk carried a gallery on its back, all of it one gray stone gone green and gold with lichen, and over the whole south front the ivy had come up like a tide, swallowing windows to their mullions, hanging in curtains from the parapets. The gables stood against the pewter sky like a fleet of ships at anchor. Not a pane of glass was lit, not a thread of smoke rose, and the silence over it was not the silence of emptiness, but of something holding its breath. Every instinct she owned told her the county was right. It was a ruin. It was folly. It was a widow's madness bought with her last coins. She picked up her bag and went on through the fallen gap in the boundary wall, across a forecourt where thistles stood higher than her waist, to a door of black oak studded with iron, and found the great key that fitted it, and the lock, which someone had kept oiled every year of 60 years, turned over as smooth as a watch, and Marian Ashcroft took possession of her estate. Inside, the light came down gray and soft through windows furred with dirt, and dust lay on everything like a fall of snow. Nobody had walked in. The great hall rose 2 stories to carved beams. With a fireplace, she could have stood inside, and the furniture stood shrouded in sheets that had themselves gone gray, so that the room seemed full of patient ghosts. But the roof held. That was the thing she noticed, the way a poor woman notices, before beauty, before sorrow. The slates had been kept sound, the gutters ran clear, the floors were firm under her feet. 60 years and someone had been paying, quietly, all that time to keep the water out. Ruins do not have dry cellars and oiled locks. Whatever this house was, it had not been abandoned. It had been kept. The way you keep a thing you mean to give to somebody. She chose a small parlor off the hall, swept it with a found broom, burned broken kindling from the yard in its grate, and slept that first night on a sheeted sofa under her cloak, and woke once in the dark to hear the house working around her, boards easing, ivy fingering the glass, and was not afraid. It did not feel like a house that wished her harm. It felt like a house that had been waiting up. She spent the whole of the next day simply learning what she owned, moving from room to room with a stub of candle in a house so large that by afternoon she had taken to leaving doors open behind her the way a woman leaves a thread through a wood. She found a library with the books still ranked on the shelves, swollen with damp at the window end and sound as new at the other. She found a long gallery where portraits of dead heroes watched her pass, men in armor, men in lace, a girl holding a posy of painted flowers, and every face of them seemed to be waiting to see what she would do. She found linen presses full of folded sheets gone yellow along their creases, and a still room with its rows of stone jars, and a cellar, dry as promised, where the wine had long ago been carried away, but the racks stood ready as though it might one day think better of it and come back. And everywhere, under the dust, she found the same quiet evidence of care. Hinges that swung true, joints that held, a house maintained for 60 years to the exact standard of a place where nobody lived, and somebody, someday, would by evening her feet ached and her candle was gone and she had stopped being afraid of the size of it. A house is only rooms, and rooms only want using. She had $4.40, a garnet brooch, and 40 rooms, and she did the only sensible thing there was, which was to begin. She opened shutters until her arms ached. She swept until the dust made her weep, and then she wept and kept sweeping. On the third day, the village found her. Mrs. Tibbles, the sexton's widow from Nether Harrow, appeared at the yard door with a loaf, a crock of butter, and the frank intention of seeing the mad woman for herself, and stayed to scrub, and came back the next day without pretending otherwise. It was Mrs. Tibbles who told her, over tea taken standing up in the vast cold kitchen, the story the way the village kept it, which was closer and stranger than the version in the Crown. Miss Euphemia Harrow had been the last of them, and the village had loved her. That was the first thing. Not feared, loved, she had been a great one for plants, for flowers, forever out on the moors and the wet levels with her paints and her presses, gentry and no side to her at all. Then her old father died. This was back in 1836, and it all went wrong somehow. The money went wrong, London men and lawyers, and everything but the Abbey itself was lost to the family man of business. And the county that had dined at her father's table turned her over like a card. They laughed at her, Mrs. Tibble said, lowering her voice as though 60 years were not enough to make it safe. In the assembly rooms at Marley, they laughed at her, called her mad, a spinster gone strange with her flowers, when she said she had been robbed. And Miss Euphemia had stopped going to Marley, and stopped receiving, and for 2 years the Abbey kept to itself. And then in the October of 1838, she had masons up from Wells, strangers, not local men, and they were 3 days at work inside, and what they did, everyone knew by the finish, was brick up the chapel, her own chapel, the old Priory Chapel in the North Range, solid. Floor to arch, windows and all, and the night they finished she went. Nobody saw her go. The dog cart never left the stable. She was simply gone, and the shutters went up, and the lawyers came, and from that day to this, Mrs. Tibble said, no one had opened that room, and no one ever would, for there was no door left to open. The children of 3 generations had dared each other to lay a hand flat on the brick, and that was as far as any of Nether Harrow cared to go with Harrowfield's business. Marion went and found it that same afternoon, while the light lasted. Down the flagged corridor, past the old buttery, where the house went from Tudor to something much older, the walls turned to cut stone, and there, where the corridor ended, was the arch. It was a pointed arch of pale dressed stone, tall as 2 men, wide as a hay wain. Carved around with vine leaves worn soft by 400 years, and every inch of it, from threshold to keystone, was filled with brick. Small, neat, dark brick, laid tight and true, 60 years old, and not a crack in it. The mortar still the color of the day it was mixed. She stood before it a long time. The air in the corridor was colder than the rest of the house, and perfectly still. And she had the strangest certainty, standing there with her candle, that the room on the other side was not empty, and had never for 1 hour of those 60 years been empty. She put her palm flat against the brick, the way 3 generations of children had, and she said quietly, because it seemed the thing to do, "I am here. I have come." And then she went back down the corridor to her broom, because certainty is not a crowbar, and hers was a household of $4.40. It was Mrs. Tibbles who brought the mason, or rather brought the story to the mason, which came to the same thing. Mr. Coombe of Nether Harrow was 60 years old and built like his own trade. And his grandfather had been one of the local men Miss Euphemia had not hired, a slight the family had never quite digested, and when he heard that the widow who had bought the Abbey for $7 meant to open the chapel and had nothing to pay him with but a garnet brooch, he turned the brooch over in his great scarred hand, gave it back, and said he would do it for the answer. 60 years he had wondered what his grandfather had not been allowed to build a wall around. He would open it to know. The vicar of Nether Harrow, Mr. Gale, a mild man with more curiosity than his sermons let on, asked leave to be present, because the chapel had been consecrated ground once, and somebody ought to stand there thinking so. And so it was that on a raw gray morning in late October, 60 years, almost to the week, since the masons from Wells had packed their tools, 4 people stood in the cold corridor by lantern light, and Mr. Coombe set his chisel to the mortar joint at shoulder height, spat on his hands, and swung. The wall did not want to go. The men who built it had been paid for honest work and had done it, and Coombe respected them aloud between blows. It was an hour before the first brick shifted, and when it came out whole in his hand, a breath of air followed it, moving outward, cold and dry and clean, and carrying a scent that made all 4 of them go still, because it was cedar, and beeswax, and faint under those, roses. Not damp, not rot, not 60 years of dark. It smelled like a room whose owner had stepped out to tea. Coombe looked at the brick in his hand and looked at Marion and said in a voice smaller than his size, "There is no damp in that air, madam. That room is dry as a Bible box." And he worked on, faster now, none of them speaking, until the hole was the size of a window. And Marion lifted the lantern to it and looked in and did not speak and could not, and the vicar looked and took off his hat, and Mrs. Tibbles looked and began very quietly to cry. The lantern light went into the dark and found gold. Not the metal, the color. It found the honeyed shine of cedar paneling run floor to vault around the whole chapel. And it found rank upon rank of shallow cabinets, dozens of them, built tight as ship's lockers down both long walls. And it found a great oak work table, 12 feet of it, standing in the middle of the stone floor, with a chair pushed back from it at an angle, just so as a chair stands when a woman has this moment risen from it. There was a blotter on the table, and a row of brushes laid straight as soldiers, and a painting box open with its colors dried to jewels, and propped on a low easel at the table's end, catching the lantern light full on, there was a watercolor of a marsh orchid, finished all but 1 leaf, and the unpainted leaf was drawn in pencil, waiting, and had been waiting 60 years. They widened the hole until a person could step through, and then, without anyone saying it should be so, they all stood aside. Because the first foot through that arch in 60 years was not going to be anyone's but hers. Marion stepped over the broken brick into the sealed chapel of Harrowfield Abbey, and stood in the middle of the cold, sweet air, and turned, slowly, all the way around, and understood that she was standing inside a life, The room had been a priory chapel 4 centuries before, and it was a chapel still, in its bones, the vault ribbed overhead, the tall windows in the north wall bricked on the outside and shuttered with cedar within, the stone altar table still standing at the east end. But Euphemia Harrow had made of it something there was no good word for. A workshop, a library, an ark. The shallow cabinets, when Marian drew the first drawer, ran on waxed runners smooth as thought, and inside, laid between sheets of soft paper, were pressed plants, each one mounted, each one labeled in a small, upright hand, the ink barely browned, marsh helleborine, bog pimpernel, meadow thistle, with the place and the day she took it, a June morning 63 years gone, drawer after drawer, cabinet after cabinet, hundreds upon hundreds of them, the whole green nation of the Somerset wetlands, gathered, named, and laid down in order like a congregation asleep. And in the portfolio boxes, standing on end in their own racked shelving like great books, were the paintings. Watercolor plates, every one the size of a tea tray, every one finished to a jeweler's polish. Marian untied the first box with cold fingers and lifted out an iris, painted so that the light seemed to come through the petals from behind, painted with a patience and an exactness and a love that stopped the breath in her throat. She turned the sheet. A water violet. She turned again. The bog myrtle, flower, leaf, catkin and root. She stood there turning sheets while the lantern burned, and the vicar and the mason and Mrs. Tibbles moved through the room behind her quiet as church, and by the time she reached the bottom of the first box of 40, she knew, though she had no learning in the field to prove it yet, that the whole county had spent 60 years laughing at one of the finest naturalists England had ever produced. Below the specimen drawers, in the deep cupboards along the south wall, they found the notebooks. Field notebooks. Scores of them, small enough for a pocket and swollen with use, their covers stained by bog water, and their pages dense with the small, upright hand. 30 years of Somerset mornings where she had walked, what the weather had done, what was in flower and what was over, what the reed cutters told her and what the eelmen knew, the water levels, the late frosts, the first swallows, all of it dated, all of it exact. There were larger volumes, too, bound in green cloth, where the field notes had been worked up fair, and between two of them. Out of order, a plainer book that was not about plants at all. It was a diary, kept in snatches, begun the week her father died, and Marian, kneeling on the cold stone with it open in her hands, read a page and closed it gently and set it aside for a night when she could do it the honor of reading it properly. Even that one glance had shown her the sentence at the top of the page. Written steadily, with no flourish, the way the woman wrote the names of flowers. "They have decided I am mad," it said. "It is a great convenience to everyone, and I begin to see it may one day be a convenience to me." There were more than 1,000 plates. They counted, in the weeks after, 1,040 finished, and the one unfinished orchid on its easel, and not one touched by damp or moth or silverfish, because the woman who made them had sealed them in cedar and lead and brick against exactly those enemies, and against one enemy more. On the great table, weighted under a green glass paperweight, lay a single sheet in the small upright hand, and it was addressed to no name. It said, "To the one who opens my door." Marian did not read it that first day. It felt like a thing that should be read when she could bring it her whole mind, and the light was going, and there was one discovery left that evening still to make. Because Mr. Coombe, walking the room's edge with his lantern in the reverent, slow way of a man in a church, had stopped at the east end and cleared his throat and said, "Madam, there is a box under the altar." It sat in the shadow of the stone table where it had sat 60 years, an iron-banded oak strongbox the size of a sea chest, black with age. with 2 hasps and a single lock of blackened steel, finer than a chest lock had any business being. And Marian, with a feeling in her chest like a bell note, went and fetched the ring of keys the solicitor had given her, and took from it the one small key of blackened steel that fitted nothing anyone had ever found, and it went into that lock as a hand goes into a glove. But she did not turn it that night. She stood up instead and said, "Tomorrow, in the daylight, with all of you here, because whatever was worth a wall was worth witnesses." And that night she sat by her parlor fire with the sheet from under the paperweight, and by the light of one candle, in the house that had waited for her, Marian Ashcroft read the letter of Euphemia Harrow. It began without preamble. "You have opened a room that a wall was paid to keep, and so you are either a thief with a crowbar, in which case what follows will do you no good at all, for the law has been provided for, or you are the owner of this house, come honestly by it, in which case you paid almost nothing for a ruin, and wanted it anyway, and you and I are already acquainted. Though I shall never know your name, sit if you are not sitting. I was 2 years building what you have found, and I would have it understood." And there, in 6 close pages, in a voice 60 years cold and clear as spring water, was the story. Her father, kind and trusting and old, the man of business he had trusted with everything, a clever, hungry, smiling attorney who had come up from nothing and meant never to go back to it. How, in the black month after her father's death, that man had produced a conveyance, properly drawn, properly witnessed, showing that the old squire had, 2 years before he died, made over to his man of business the whole of the Harrow fortune, the farms, the funds, the timber. Everything but the Abbey itself and a small annuity in settlement of debts no one had ever heard of until that hour. How the county had chosen to believe it because the man was plausible and the lady was odd, a spinster past 40 who grubbed in bogs and painted weeds, and it is easier to believe a woman mad than a gentleman wicked. How she had said in the assembly rooms at Marley that the conveyance was a forgery, said it plainly, once, and watched the room decide, in the space of a fan's flutter, that poor Miss Harrow's wits had gone with her fortune. "They laughed," she wrote. "I wish you to know that I was there when they laughed, and that I made my curtsy and went home and was not seen in Marley again. People will tell you I hid from shame. I did not. I was busy. 2 years busy. Because the clever man had made one mistake, the mistake such men always make, she wrote, he thought a woman's patience was the same thing as a woman's surrender. She had kept his letters. Every letter Josiah Ashcroft had ever written to her father she had kept, and in the 2 years before the wall went up, she had quietly gathered more. Letters in which he begged her father for time on his own debts, dated within months of the day the conveyance would have him a rich man. Letters no debtor writes to the man who supposedly owes him everything. She had the true draft of her father's will and testament in his own hand, leaving all to her, made after the date on the forged conveyance, and speaking of the fortune as his own to leave. She had the attested statements of 2 witnesses to the conveyance, an old clerk and a groom, taken down before a commissioner in Bristol in the year the wall was built, both swearing the signature they had witnessed was on a different paper, a lease, read aloud to them as a lease. It is proof, she wrote. It was proof then, but proof is a seed, and the ground in this county in this year is stone. He has the funds, and with the funds the friends, and my witnesses are old men who eat his bread. No court in the west of England would hear it from me now, and he would burn what I could not put beyond his reach. So I have put it beyond his reach. Marian read that page twice, and the name a third time, and sat very still in the small circle of her candle while the size of it came home to her. Josiah Ashcroft. She had seen the portrait at Levenshall Court 100 times. At the turn of the great stair, a heavy-jawed man painted against a column in a sky, the grandfather, the founder, the maker of the family, dead these many years and spoken of at that table with the special reverence rich families keep for the source of the money. Edmund's grandfather. Julian's, the fortune that had dined off silver while she was shown the door with one carpet bag, the fortune that had made Augusta's voice so pleasant and so sure on the gravel sweep, that fortune had a name and a date of birth, and Euphemia Harrow had written both on the outside of a packet and sealed it in a strong box under an altar, and a widow turned out by that same fortune's heirs had bought the box. And the room, and the wall, and the truth for $7, because a dead woman's lawyers had been instructed to sell her house to whoever wanted a home badly enough to be laughed at for it. I do not know how long you have been reading, the last page said. Here is the rest. The Abbey and my annuity were left me because the Abbey is entailed ground and my annuity was my mother's. And even he could not touch them, and so he let them stand and called it kindness before the county. Very well. The annuity has gone every quarter these 2 years to Mistress Pettifer and Snow of Wells, and will go on going with instructions. They are honest, as lawyers go, the father at least, and they are paid to be patient. The house will be kept dry. The taxes will be kept paid. And when 60 years have run, and every soul who laughed in that assembly room is safely underground where opinions cannot be changed, my trustees will sell this house at open auction as it stands to any bidder at whatever price is freely offered. Whoever pays a fortune for a ruin wants the lead off the roof or the stone out of the walls. Whoever pays a trifle and comes and stays wants what I wanted, which is the house itself and a door that shuts behind them. To that one, whoever you are, I leave the work of my life, which is in the cabinets, and the means of my justice, which is under the altar, and my funds, which by now are considerable, for compound interest is the one form of patience even lawyers respect. Do with the work what it deserves. Do with the proofs what you judge right. Burn them if the family his money bought has come to deserve better than its beginnings. I am past caring for revenge. I find, at the end, I care only that somebody, once, should know that I was not mad, and that the flowers were worth the painting. The signature was small and firm. Euphemia Harrow, October 1838, and underneath, in the same hand, smaller, a last line she must have added standing at the table with her cloak on, for the ink was different. The orchid on the easel wants one leaf. If you have a steady hand and a clear conscience, finish it. Marian Ashcroft sat by her dying fire until very late, with the letter in her lap, and what she felt was not triumph, though the means of a very complete triumph was sitting under an altar 40 feet from her chair. What she felt, she said long afterward, was accompanied. 2 women, 60 years apart, put out of doors by the same money. And one of them had built the other a refuge and baited it with $7 worth of patience, and it had worked, and there is no loneliness that entirely survives the discovery that someone, long ago, thought of you. In the morning, they opened the strong box, all 4 of them present, and the vicar wrote out an inventory as it came up into the light, item by item, in his careful hand. As Marian had asked him to, witnesses being the one thing Euphemia Harrow had lacked and the one thing Marian intended never to lack again. The true will and testament of old Squire Harrow in his own hand. The letters of Josiah Ashcroft, 91 of them, docketed and tied. The attested statements from Bristol, seals unbroken. The forged conveyance itself, or rather the certified copy the court had made, annotated in Euphemia's small hand, the false strokes of the signature marked out like a botanist marking the difference between 2 sedges. and her own will, drawn and witnessed in 1838, sealed, with a wrapper directing it to Pettifer and Snow. When the last packet was out and listed, Mr. Coombe, who had said almost nothing for an hour, looked at the empty box and then at Marian and said, "Madam, I have opened a wall for you, and I would take it kindly if you would tell me what it is I have opened." And Marian looked around the sealed chapel of Harrowfield Abbey, at the cabinets and the plates and the papers and the one unfinished orchid, and told them, plainly, all of it, because the days of this story belonging to nobody were over. The letter went to Wells that afternoon, and Mr. Pettifer came out the next day, which for Mr. Pettifer was the same as running. He was shown into the chapel and stood in the middle of it in his black coat, turning his hat in his hands, and it was some time before he trusted himself to speak. "My father," he said at last, "kept this trust 40 years and died not knowing what it kept. I have kept it 20 more. We knew the terms, madam, never the reasons." He put on his spectacles and read Euphemia's letter through twice, and read the vicar's inventory, and examined the seals on the Bristol statements with a jeweler's glass from his waistcoat, and then he sat down at the great table, moved the blotter 1 inch square with his fingertips, and became, before her eyes, a different and much more dangerous kind of old man. "The will of Miss Harrow," he said. "We shall prove it once. That is plain sailing and glad work, and I will tell you now what the trust stands at, for I had it drawn up quarterly all my life. With 60 years of compounding, upward of $90,000, madam, and every cent of it, under the terms you have read, yours with the house." Mrs. Tibbles had to sit down on an altar step. Marian did not move, so he went on. "As to the other matter," he touched the tied letters the way a man touches a loaded gun. "The man is dead, and the dead are past prosecuting. But fraud, madam, does not die with the man who did it. What was taken passed to his estate, and his estate stands behind Levenshall Court to this day, and a claim lies on this evidence 60 years old and fresh as paint. I have been a careful man all my life," he said, "and I tell you carefully, no court that sees these papers will call Miss Harrow mad. The word is proved. The question," he said, taking off the spectacles and looking at her with something that was almost gentleness, "is what the owner of these papers wishes done, for they are property, and the property, with everything else in this room, is yours." She did not answer him that day, and he did not press her, and this also is part of the story, because what Marian Ashcroft did next was, for a season, nothing. The will of Euphemia Harrow was proved at the registry before Christmas, quietly, and the fund passed to Marian, and the first thing she bought with it was coal, and the second was wages, fair ones, for every pair of hands in Nether Harrow that wanted work, and that winter Harrowfield Abbey came back to life the way a hearth comes back, from the middle outward. Slates, leadwork, glass, the kitchen chimney drew for the first time in 60 years, and Mrs. Tibbles wept over a range you could have roasted an ox in. Mr. Coombe went over every arch and lintel in the building with his hands the way a doctor goes over a patient, and pronounced the old priory work better than anything done in England since. The village came up the lane by 2s and 3s all winter, shy as deer, to be given tea in the great hall and to look at the madwoman's bargain with its fires lit, and went home changed on the subject of madness. She hired girls from the village and trained them herself, and paid them what a housemaid earned in London, which scandalized 2 neighboring households and mended 3 village roofs before Leedy Day. She had the walled kitchen garden dug over, and its old espaliers pruned by a man who had thought he was too old ever to be asked for his skill again. And when he protested that half the trees were past saving, she said they would save the half they could, which he repeated in the village that night as though it were scripture. And in the evening she read Euphemia's diary through, slowly, a few pages at a time, the way you take a cordial, and learned the whole shape of those 2 silent years. the visits that stopped. The letters that went unanswered, the cousin in Madeira who alone had written kindly and to whom, Marian now understood, a woman with a plain cloak and a patient plan had gone quietly by sea from Bristol one October night and lived out her days by another ocean, under another name, at peace among other people's flowers. The trust had received notice of her death from a chaplain there in the year 1851. She had never once written back to Somerset. There had been nobody left in Somerset she owed a letter to. But the chapel Marian kept exactly as it was found, brick dust swept, nothing else moved, the chair at its angle, the orchid on its easel, because she had written to the County Museum at Taunton. To a Dr. Loveday, keeper of natural history, a letter of 3 careful sentences, and the answer had come back by return post, underlined twice. Dr. Loveday arrived on a day of sleet, a round, bald, excitable gentleman swathed in mufflers, prepared, he later admitted, to be kind for 10 minutes to a widow with a folder of flower paintings. He was in the chapel 4 hours. When he came out, he was bareheaded, his mufflers in his hand, and he asked Marian for a chair and sat down on it in the cold corridor beside the broken wall. And said, "Madam, I must write to London tonight, and I am trying to compose in my head a letter that will not be taken as a symptom of fever. What you have in that room is the complete flora of the Somerset wetlands, executed over some 30 years, to a standard, madam, to a standard I have seen matched perhaps twice in the national collections. With field notes that put half our published county floras to shame, made by a woman this profession never heard of, because 60 years ago nobody in a position to look ever bothered to look. He stood up again because he could not stay sitting. They called her mad, I understand. Madam, if this is madness, I know 40 fellows of learned societies who should be so afflicted. The learned men came down from London through the whole of that spring, singly and in delegations, and stood in the sealed chapel with their hats off, and the word went round the societies and then round the newspapers, first the county sheet and then the London ones. The strange and singing story of it, the lost naturalist, the brick chapel, the 1,000 plates. The Abbey sold under a dead woman's instruction for $7 to the one bidder who wanted it, and Nether Harrow got used to gigs at the crossroads and gentlemen of the press taking the air on the lane, and Marian, who had been turned out of one great house with a carpet bag, found she was becoming, without leaving her own, the most talked of woman in the west of England. Which is how they learned of it at Levenshall Court. She had wondered in a quiet way how long it would take, and it took until the fund was public knowledge, which told her everything about the quality of the family's attention. Julian came in March, all the way up the Abbey Lane behind a good horse, and was received civilly in the great hall, under the roof his $7 could not buy. And he was all smiles, and the smiles were the same ones he had never spent on her in 3 years at his table. He hoped bygones might be bygones. He spoke of family feeling, twice without visible difficulty. He understood there was a collection, and ventured that she would want it seen to properly, valued, protected, placed. There were men in London he could speak to. This sort of thing wanted a family behind it. Marian let him talk, the way you let a pump run rusty water until it comes clear, and when it was clear at last what he had come for, she asked him her one question, pleasantly, over the teacups. Did the name Josiah mean anything to him? And she watched him not understand, watched the name slide off the polished surface of everything he had ever been told about his own money, and found she was glad, because it meant the ignorance, at least, was honestly inherited. Come to the exhibition at Taunton, she said, rising, meaning the interview was over. Everything will be shown there. Everything will be said. The exhibition opened in May in the long gallery of the County Museum, and it is remembered. The plates hung 4 deep, and the gaslight on all that patient color made the room hum like a hive, and the whole county came. The same county, gray now, that had done the laughing 60 years before, and its children and grandchildren stood in front of the marsh orchid, finished all but one leaf, with the story printed plain on a card beside it, and were quiet. Augusta Ashcroft came, in black silk with Julian, and stood in the front rank of that gathering as of right, expecting, it was clear from her face, to be gathered graciously into her daughter-in-law's remarkable season. For money forgives money, and the world was watching. Dr. Loveday spoke, and the president of a London society spoke, and then Marian Ashcroft, mistress of Harrowfield Abbey, stood up before the county in her gray dress with no jewel but a garnet brooch, and told the story of Euphemia Harrow, all of it, plainly, in the level voice of a rector's daughter reading the lesson. She told them about the Flora and the 30 years of mornings on the levels it had cost. She told them about the conveyance and the clever smiling man of business who had made a great fortune between a fortnight's forgeries, and she named him Josiah Ashcroft, clearly twice, and the room turned in one slow rustle to look at the front rank, and the front rank did not move. She told them about the assembly rooms at Marley, the laughter, the word mad, and how the maddest woman in Somerset had then quietly outthought every soul who used it, had banked her proofs where no fire could reach them, and her rescue where no fraud could, and played a game of patience 60 years long against people who thought patience was surrender, and won. The proofs, she said, are in the case by the window, and they were under glass the true will, the begging letters in Josiah's own hand, the sworn statements with their seals shown broken before witnesses, the forged signature annotated in a dead woman's botanical hand, and the county filed past them all that evening in a silence you could have leaned on. The claim, she said, had been lodged with the court, for the money taken had built a family that could well afford at last to give back what was never given, only taken, and her voice did not rise at all when she said it, which they said afterward was the worst of it. And then, because she was owed one thing more and knew exactly where it was kept, she looked for the first time directly at the front rank, at the pleasant, certain, ruined face of Augusta Ashcroft, and said, I was told once, on a fine morning, that I came to a family with nothing, and that it would be dishonest to let me leave with more. It was well said. It was only said to the wrong woman about the wrong family, one thief's fortune too soon. And the county of Somerset watched Augusta Ashcroft walk the length of the gallery to the door on her son's arm, through that silence, past 60 years of flowers. The claim never came to trial. Faced with the papers, the Ashcroft lawyers advised what lawyers advise when the other side holds everything, and it was settled by midsummer, restitution in full measure. And Levenshulme Court was mortgaged to its chimneys to pay it, and the county, which had learned the whole story standing in a gaslit gallery, drew its own conclusions at its own pace, which is the way of counties, and the invitations that had once apologized for Marian stopped coming to Levenshulme at all. Marian took no joy in that part and did not pretend to. And when it was suggested to her that she might press further, for the disgrace could have been made complete, she said that Euphemia Harrow had asked for one thing only, that somebody should know she was not mad, and that this was now known from Wells to London, and the rest was only money finding its way home. She endowed with part of it a gallery at the county museum, to keep the flora together forever under Euphemia's name, restored at last to the list of her science, and the learned societies that had never heard of the living woman fell over one another to honor the dead one, which Marian allowed, on the grounds that it was late, but it was not nothing. The publication of the Flora began that autumn, in parts, a volume a year. The Flora of the Somerset Levels and Moors by Euphemia Harrow edited from her manuscripts, and it stands on the shelves of every botanist in England to this day, with her name down the spine, and the reviews that mattered used, words the assembly rooms at Marley would not have recognized, words like exact and patient and beyond praise. Marian read every proof sheet herself at the great table in the chapel, in the chair that had waited at its angle, and if you had told her, on the gravel sweep of Levenshall Court on the morning of the burning leaves, where she would be sitting within the year, she would not have been able to hear you for the size of it. The chapel windows were opened last of all. She had left them brick through that whole first year, out of a feeling she did not examine too closely, that the room should keep its own weather until its work was done, and it was June again, and the last proof of the first volume had gone back to London, before Mr. Coombe and his sons took the infill gently out of the north lights and released the glass. And the morning came through the old greenish quarrels and lay down across the cedar and the cabinets and the long table for the first time in 61 years, and the light in the sealed chapel of Harrowfield Abbey turned out to be the color of honey, which Mrs. Tibble said was no more than that room had earned. Marian stood in it a long while. Then she sat down at the table and took up the dried brushes and chose the best of them and made new color in a dead woman's paint box. And with a steady hand, and she trusted a clear conscience, she painted one leaf. She lived at the Abbey all the rest of her days, and they were long and they were good. The village came and went through the gardens as though 60 years of shut gates had never happened. Mrs. Tibbles ruled the kitchens. Mr. Coombe grew old and lordly as steward of the works, and never tired of telling how the wall had fought him. Dr. Loveday came every summer with his mufflers and his enthusiasms. And travelers on the Wells Road at dusk, seeing the great gray house standing up out of its trees with its windows lit, would ask at the inn in Nether Harrow about it and be told the story every soul in that village could tell by heart, the story of the house that sold for $7, of the woman they laughed at who was worth the lot of them, and of the widow turned out with nothing who opened the one door in England that had been waiting 60 years for her knock. And the tellers of it always ended the same way, with the thing the whole county had come to understand in a gaslit gallery in Taunton, which is that a lie can be plausible and well-dressed and believed by everyone in the room, and it will still lose in the end. To a patient woman with a steady hand, because Euphemia Harrow was patient longer than a lie could last, and Marian Ashcroft was the proof of it, alive, at home, at peace, in the house that waited.